Now, here are Morgan Streetman and Roxanne Wilder.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Morgan Streetman Show. The voice you're hearing is not Morgan Streetman, which you would know if you're familiar with his sonorous voice. My name is Jeff Deist. I'm a great friend of Morgan's, known him for many, many years, and he's off today. So he asked me to sub for him, and I said I would. Many of you may know the Mises Institute, which is my employer. The Mises Institute at Mises.org is a place for all of your alternative economics, let's just say. The kind of economics which Morgan talks about quite a bit on his show, week in and week out. The Austrian school, which is really a very different way of looking at what's going on out there. And boy, oh boy, do we need economics, because it sure feels like, if you've been following the news the last few days, I hope you had a great weekend. It didn't follow it too close. But, of course, we had the Supreme Court dump before they went into recess on Thursday and Friday, and we got this Dobbs decision, which deals with abortion, the longstanding Roe versus Wade precedent in this country. And so if you spend a lot of time in traditional media, the 24-hour talking head shows, or in social media, either way, you've probably been bombarded with news and opinion about abortion rules in this country. And here's my fear. My fear, ladies and gentlemen, is that these midterm elections coming up are going to be about abortion and guns and voting rights and trans and what we loosely call social issues. And, of course, everybody in Florida knows that those have been on the front burner a bit with Governor Ron DeSantis and his spats with Disney. But boy, oh boy, we have real economic problems in this country, real fiscal problems. We have, in my opinion, the potential for a real economic calamity in, let's say, the short term, the coming several years in this country. And we ought to be addressing it. And as much as I don't enjoy politics, as much as I wish we were more focused on economics in this country than politics, there is a political element to all of this. And so if this becomes a social issues election, and more importantly, if the country is just focused on social issues, as almost as a distraction to our underlying economic problems, whether that's the midterm elections or whether that's more generally what we call the culture war, red states versus blue states, the increasing polarization we're always reading about, and this Dobbs decision dealing with Roe v. Wade certainly accelerates that. It just makes me very concerned that we are glossing over the economic problems in this country. And Florida's been at the epicenter of this. I mean, especially since COVID, but even before that, people were to an extent voting with their feet. They were to an extent self-segregating. Certainly there's an urban-rural divide in this country. That's as much a cultural and almost sociological phenomenon as it is economic. But nonetheless, COVID intensified and accelerated that. And a lot of people, maybe regardless of their politics, were moving to places that were more open during COVID from a business perspective, from a travel perspective, from a day-to-day perspective with the masks and the mandates and the shutdowns. And Florida benefited enormously from this. But I don't need to tell all of you that as a result of this self-segregation, and a result also, I would argue, of all the tremendous money printing by Congress on the fiscal side and all the credit creation by the Fed on the monetary side, there's an awful lot of new money and credit out there sloshing around the system. So you combine increased demand to live in Florida with a lot more money and credit chasing the same amount of houses, or, well, there's some new houses being built, but not a lot, and not as fast as they need to be built in a country this vast. And so Morgan's listeners know that across Tampa, across St. Pete, across Clearwater, housing is a real problem. It's a real problem that it's going up and up and up. And so we assume, well, that's a good thing, Jeff. Gee whiz, my house is worth more. But we don't view it that way when groceries are going up or when gas is going up. You say, well, okay, but that's a consumable item. My house is an investment. Well, maybe it is. Houses go down sometimes, too. Does anyone remember 2007 to about 2012? Houses went down, 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 both not in nominal terms and very much so in real terms, which is to say inflation-adjusted terms. So I thought we'd do a little thought experiment this morning and go back 40 years and talk about the median housing price in the Tampa Bay region in 1982. Well, that was roughly $73,670 would have bought you the median house in Tampa. And, of course, that just means half the houses were cheaper and half were more expensive. Of course, it's not the average because that's very much skewed by there's some very luxury, expensive, multi-million-dollar homes in Tampa, of course, needless to say. So $73,000 roughly. Contrast that with 2022 where it's $453,770. So, 6-7 times as much. And why do we care about that? Well, in a sense, we don't care about the numbers per se, as long as your average salary or a Tampa resident's average salary went up that same 6 or 7x over those years, right? We don't care about the price of something as much as we care about the affordability. And the affordability relates to people's salaries and income, of course, and sometimes their savings rate. So, boy, $73,000 in 1982. But back then, let's say a 20% down payment would have cost you about $14,000 or $15,000. But so you would have ended up borrowing $55,000 to $60,000. But here's the kicker. Here's what people forget, and especially younger people. If you're under 40 or 50, you have no conception of this. But the average mortgage interest rate in 1982 on that house you were buying in Tampa was about 17%, folks. 17%. So even though the price of a house, the cost of a home was, 1/6 or 1/7, the monthly mortgage payment on a 30-year anyway was about half. It was about $850 versus about $1,683 today. And why is that? Well, that's because the average mortgage interest rate was 17% today, even with the increases of the last year. It's only about maybe 3.75%. And a year ago, folks, that was even less. A year ago, you could get a fixed rate if you were a prime borrower well below 2. And you should have if you could have, by the way. So, but even at 3.76%, that's about a $1,600 mortgage payment. And again, this is for the median house. I'm not saying that you can necessarily go out and buy a house for $453,000 in Tampa today without competing with a bunch of people that's going to, I don't know. That might not satisfy your housing preference. You might want a fancier place than that, or you might want a cheaper place than that. And the tragedy in all this, of course, the tragedy is that, yes, a lot of people's house is worth more, especially, let's just say it, that baby boomer generation that oftentimes has a house that's paid for, or perhaps that bought his or her house in Tampa back in the 70s or 80s, and it's nearly paid for, and they paid, again, that $73,000, where it's the younger folks today. It's the younger folks today whom I worry about, especially in markets like Tampa. They're very much struggling to pay rent, to make rent in these areas where rents are just going up and up and up. And as housing prices go up, more people are going to be forced into renting who may wish to buy. And the other thing is that landlords, understandably, want to increase rents when leases are up. That's the market, folks. And oftentimes, big rent increases, which are announced hopefully in advance by the landlord, they're almost an eviction. For lower income folks who are maybe surviving off welfare or disability payments, folks who are maybe surviving off a lower paid job, a minimum wage job. So if they get a $200, $300, $400, $500 monthly rent increase, they might be forced to move out. They might be forced to move farther out of town and then have to drive farther to make that monthly rent every month. So it's a tough situation in that sense. And boy, oh boy, you look at things that are right in front of our face, like housing prices, rent, gas, groceries, which we'll talk about in the next segment. Awfully hard to hide those from the population. This is the Morgan Streetman Show. This is Money Talk 1010 a.m. I'm your guest host, Jeff Deist. We got to take a quick commercial break. We'll be right back after this. Stay with us. Happy Monday, Tampa. Welcome back, everybody. This is the Morgan Streetman Show on Money Talk 1010 a.m. Happy Monday to everybody. This is not Morgan Streetman. Morgan's off today. My name is Jeff Deist. I'm a longtime colleague and friend of Morgan's, and let's be fair, I share his worldview. I'll just say that generally. He's a great guy and also someone whom I've had a lot of long conversations with about the economy and about where we're headed, and discussing in the last segment rents and mortgage prices in Tampa, across Tampa Bay. I had a wedding this weekend, actually, in Jacksonville. And so I filled up my tank, as you might imagine. And I have a mid-size sedan. I have an old 2006 Mercedes, an E350, beautiful car. And I know some of you listen to Dave Ramsey. My secret over the years has been buying used cars for cash in that $10,000 to $15,000 range, which unfortunately doesn't get you very much anymore since COVID. Oh my gosh, used cars have just gone through the roof. But nonetheless, that's always been my secret, and let me tell you why. Because I hate to say it, a lot of people don't have $10,000 to $15,000 cash to buy a used car, and a lot of the finance companies won't provide financing for an older used car in that $10,000 to $15,000 range. So it's an excellent sweet spot for cash buyers if you're sort of looking at the classifieds or Craigslist or whatever it might be. So I've had some success in that area buying, nice luxury older cars. But nonetheless, let's say, I think I paid $11,000 for this car. I'll just be frank. But honestly, my mindset when I bought it was that I'm really paying about $20,000 because I know there's going to be some expensive repairs along the way. But nonetheless, if you go in with that mindset, $20,000 is still way less than, I don't know, a Honda Accord these days is $35,000 or something like that. So, but even with that Mercedes, which is a 6-cylinder, it's got, I think, about a 20-gallon tank. It cost me almost $100 to fill up. I think I paid $443 or something like that. And I'm thinking to myself, a lot of people have big SUVs, big F-150 pickups, and not to mention the RV people. I mean, they're, and God bless our truck drivers, especially the independents who are driving these big diesel rigs, and they're paying $1,000, $1,200 to fill up. And some of them are independent business people. They don't have a gas card. That's part of their cost to run their independent business. And everything you buy, ladies and gentlemen, virtually, even if it came on a boat from China, even if it came on an airplane on FedEx Cargo, even if it came on a UPS truck from Amazon, it probably went that last mile on a truck. It probably got to Target or Walmart or your local Wawa, wherever it probably got there on a truck. And guess what? That truck burned diesel. So this affects the price of everything you pay. Diesel's well over $5 a gallon, probably about $5.50 in most places. And I was thinking to myself, as I filled my tank for $95 to go to this wedding in Jacksonville, boy, oh boy, the Biden administration is going to have an awful hard time obscuring that from the American public because that's a day in, day out big ticket item for most of you. You drive down the street, they have big, LED signs that tell you what the gas price is, and it's almost an advertisement for the shape we're in as an economy. And we got to understand, folks, energy is vital, absolutely vital to an economy. Energy is a form of almost untold wealth in any society. If you look at the poorest places on earth, what they don't have is abundant, dense electricity from coal. What they don't have is abundant, dense energy from gasoline or natural gas being refined and burned in their vehicles. And we have this across the West. It's almost an underlying form of energy in our society. You flip the switch, there's your electricity. You turn on the hot water, there's your hot water. You go to the gas station, there's your gas. You go to Target, there's 50 kinds of toothpaste, which makes Bernie Sanders unhappy, but Apparently we like it because Target keeps selling it to us. And that is, we don't pay enough attention to energy. We've taken it for granted so long. And, those of us who have the good fortune to have been born in the West and also enjoy some kind of middle-class lifestyle, we haven't had to think too much about gas and electricity bills and home heating bills as a percentage of our income. It's something you pay. And we might have to start thinking about it more, folks, because, again, that $4.43 I paid at the pump, that is going to trickle through the economy in ways you cannot imagine. And if you look at some of these countries which have gone further and faster with the so-called green revolution, the Green New Deal, like Germany, for example, folks, this is a wealthy, very wealthy per capita, Western industrialized country. This isn't Greece. This isn't Turkey. And it sure as heck isn't a poor African country. And yet they've been shutting down their nuclear power plants after the Fukushima incident about 10 years ago now in Japan. Germany's been shutting down its nuclear power plants. The United States isn't building any new ones, folks. A new one came online in Georgia recently. It's not online yet. It's completed, the building portion, but that's it. America is basically losing old nuclear plants and not replacing them. Germany's shutting them down. And unlike the United States, the Germans import a huge percentage of their oil to run their cars from Russia. Whoops. And now Russia's saying, oh, okay, we're an international pariah. Well, we can reduce our oil exports as a pariah. That's what pariahs do. Now, fortunately, in the United States, we don't import very much oil from Russia. It's way less than 10%. But it doesn't matter where we import it from, folks. We don't refine enough. We're not building new refineries. We haven't built really any since the 70s. And that's a choke point. It doesn't matter how much oil you have if you can't refine it quickly enough. And if you talk to oil company executives, and I'm not a big fan of them because in some ways they're subsidized and they've given a lot of lip service to this Green New Deal instead of opposing it. They should be honest and bold and say, you know what, we're not apologizing for fossil fuels. Fossil fuels have made the West rich beyond belief. They have given us the dynamic, interconnected global economy we enjoy. And that's why that toothbrush or that toothpaste at Target is $3 instead of $8. Okay, so they shouldn't be apologetic, and they are. But nonetheless, oil company executives have told us, hey, look, we believe the politicians when they tell us that fossil fuels aren't the future. We're all going to be driving electric cars, this sort of thing. We believe you, and so we're not going to put millions and millions of dollars into new refineries because that kind of capital investment, they will tell you, takes decades to repay. And that's a very uncertain future, isn't it? Who's going to invest in that? And so, this idea that we're all going to drive electric cars soon, folks, just with these heat waves we've experienced throughout, let's say, the lower two-thirds of the U.S., except for the northern states the last couple of weeks, we've had governors telling everybody, hey, can you not plug in your electric car, please, this afternoon because the grid is stressed and everyone's running their air conditioning. Well, something like 1% of U.S. vehicles are electric. What's that going to be like when it's 25 or 50%, which they're trying to not, this isn't the marketplace. This is government telling us we're going to reach these levels soon. We're going to mandate these levels. And then the auto manufacturers follow suit and say that's what we're going to do. Folks, electricity, batteries don't run cars. Batteries store electricity. That electricity comes from burning coal or, in some cases, nuclear power. But we're anti-coal now, and we're shutting down nuclear plants. Where's it going to come from? This idea that the Green New Deal, is going to provide us with all kinds of renewable energy sources from wind or solar or hydro, it just isn't true, folks. There's just not enough capacity unless we're all willing to accept a much lower standard of living. Less air conditioning, be hot and sweating, fewer goods and services, less driving, less air travel. Is that our future? There's a new book by a brilliant guy named Alex Epstein called Fossil Future. Thoroughly researched, thoroughly detailed, painstakingly written. I recommend it to you on Amazon. Alex Epstein, Fossil Future. He's laid this all out, folks. He spent a couple of very difficult years coming up with the numbers and the facts on all this. And the idea that we're just going to somehow, without any trade-offs, We're going to create these great new jobs, says Joe Biden and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and we're going to just run America and the West on wind and solar and hydro and all these renewable sources. No, we're not. We're not going to do that. The numbers aren't there unless we're willing to accept just less energy, which means we're poorer, less comfortable, less happy, lower standard of living. And I don't think that's what we want in this country. Joe Biden campaigned on this. He said it openly during Democratic debates. Bernie Sanders standing next to him. He had to out-Bernie to appeal to those primary voters. And he said quite openly, we're going to stop drilling. We're going to stop it. We're going to stop burning fossil fuels in this country. If you go back to the Barack Obama administration, 2013, Barack Obama, Secretary of Energy, said we got more shale, more gas, more natural gas, more oil than we ever imagined in the Bakken region, North Dakota. But apparently we're not going to burn it. We're going to leave it in the ground, folks. That's what the Democrats tell us. This is Money Talk 1010 a.m. I'm Jeff Deist. We'll be right back after these messages. Welcome back to the show, everybody. This is the Morgan Streetman Show. I am sitting in for Morgan. My name's Jeff Deist. Check out Mises.org, Mises.org, which is my employer. And you can find out all kinds of facts about the economy just by reading Mises.org every day. If you read Zero Hedge, for example, you'll know what we're all about at the Mises Institute. Here's my thing about Zero Hedge is read it in the morning with your coffee. Don't read it right before you go to bed because sometimes the economic news out there is a little scary, folks. And instead of talking about it, instead of having serious, sober adults in our political class actually try to grapple with some of these problems like inflation and the dollar and debt and future entitlement promises, we spend a lot of time talking about abortion and guns and trans and things like that. And I'm not dismissing those as issues. I get it. But, boy, I wish we had some adults minding the store. You know, we were talking in an earlier segment about capital investment in refineries, which oil company executives are loath to do. So why isn't there more capital investment in this country? What are we doing politically that dissuades this, which is the opposite of persuade? Well, one thing we're doing is we get really low interest rates, folks. We were talking about the cost of housing and mortgages across Tampa Bay. And here's what's so interesting. I want to get back to that real quickly. Let's talk about interest rates. What are interest rates? Well, they're a very important signal to the economy because when interest rates are low, people think it's a good thing to borrow more money. When they're high, people think it's a good thing to save more money. And we have been involved in basically a 40-year unprecedented experiment, not just in America, but in human history. In the whole history of the West. We've been involved in a 40-year experiment since about the early 1980s in radically lower and lower and lower interest rates. In fact, they got so low, they got so little, they got so squeezed when COVID came along that you almost couldn't see them anymore. You need a microscope to see interest rates because the nominal interest rate set by the Fed, it's called the Fed funds rate. There's a little bit of complexity to that. That's an interbank lending rate, but nonetheless, the Fed funds rate is generally the baseline. And assuming you're a prime borrower, you're going to pay a couple of percentage points over that baseline rate because the banks have to make some money and account for their risk in lending you some money for your mortgage and that sort of thing. And if you're a subprime borrower overall, you're going to pay more than that. So for the last 40 years, what the U.S. Federal Reserve has done, and especially really Western central banks in general have done, if they pushed interest rates down and down and down and down and down. Now, if you're old enough to remember the late 70s, early 80s, you will recall, as I mentioned earlier in the show, hey, I had to spend 17, 18% to get a mortgage or a credit card or a car loan back then. And that was a lot of interest, folks. That adds up quick, and that ends up being half of what you're paying. But, you think, well, that's a bad thing, right? And you think, well, today you can go get a mortgage as a prime borrower, maybe 3.75%. That's a good thing, right? Because it costs people less and those greedy banks make less money and this and that. Well, it's not so good if you're a saver. Because here's what's so radically different about our economy today, which I think all of us, whether you follow economic news or not, I think all of us feel it, right? And there's a feeling that things aren't firm. They're not built on a solid foundation, that the economy is shaky. And that feeling, I think, is awfully hard for the Biden administration to shake, even if it's subconscious almost. People just sense that there's something wrong. And then some people, of course, spend all their time, like me, reading about politics and economics and trying to be informed as best we can be. And we like to think that we know that something's wrong. But nonetheless, if you go back to 1982 and you say, yeah, I had to spend 17% on interest for my mortgage. But here's the thing. You could get 14% at the bank on a simple savings account or a simple CD. So if you weren't a borrower, if you were a saver, if your house in 1982 was already paid for, let's say, or mostly paid for, you were an elderly person, you could simply be thrifty. You could simply be thrifty and stick money in a safe bank account, FDI insured, as safe as it gets, let's just say, or a simple 6-month or 1-year CD and get 15% on it. You didn't have to be some financial whiz. You didn't have to go out there and worry about your money all day. You didn't have to go out there and think, well, which FANG stock am I going to buy? Let me look at Tesla. Do I need to buy Bitcoin? What do I got to buy to beat inflation, right? I mean, you could just simply go buy a simple, safe investment because you could get 14, 15% on a savings account or a CD, folks. And yeah, inflation was high in the late 70s and early 80s. It's probably about what it is now, 7-8%, depending on how you calculate it. And they've monkeyed with that. So I would argue it's actually higher today. But let's just take the official numbers, which are about 8.6 today. So yeah, inflation was 8%, late 70s, early 80s. But if you were saving money, you could get 15% simply by being thrifty, by not spending your entire paycheck, let's say, putting some of it into a bank. And that's a remarkable thing when we think about it, the magic of compounding interest. I know for a fact my grandparents simply were very, very thrifty. They weren't particularly invested in the stock market. I think late in my grandfather's life, he started to get into a few stocks. He was a very modestly paid person with a modest income. And I remember as a little boy, they had a party back in the old-fashioned days. This would have been the 70s when I was little. And they burned their little piece of paper from the mortgage because they'd paid it off. A poignant memory from my childhood. And I remember my dad telling me later, they actually made a mistake paying that off because it was a fixed rate. And they should have, instead of paying it off quickly, they should have been investing some of their monthly mortgage interest payment. And that investment would have grown faster than the interest they were paying on their mortgage. But, they were old-fashioned, and that was the thing. You wanted to be out of debt. They were Depression-era folks. And that was a goal. And God bless them, they did it. And they did it simply by being thrifty on one income. And this 40-year experiment we've been engaged in, we, meaning the banking class, let's say, and the political class, of pushing interest rates down and down and down and down and down and down and down till they were basically zero. And in places in Europe, they're below zero, even nominally. Right? There are Euro bonds, both government and corporate bonds, which you can go buy. I don't know why you would, to pay a negative interest rate. You pay, you lose some of your principal every year for the privilege of owning that bond. Not my kind of investment, but nonetheless, if that's the least dirty shirt in the laundry, I guess, people lock in their rate of loss for the period of the bond. And say what you will about Treasury debt, you can still buy U.S. Treasuries now, the 10 years up above 10% now. At least you get a positive yield nominally. You can make interest. You can make 3%. But here's the thing, folks. If inflation is 8%, that's what they say. I think it's higher. But let's just say, for sake of argument, if inflation's 8% and you're getting 3% on that 10-year Treasury, you're losing 5% every year. Okay, that's the real interest rate. So they can be raising rates, and the real interest rate can still be going down. Do you understand what I'm saying? So if you take the real interest rate equals the nominal rate, the rate you're getting paid, and now it's 3 point something percent on that 10-year minus inflation. So the nominal rate minus inflation, that's your real interest rate, your real rate of return. And folks, right now that's negative on U.S. Treasury debt in inflation-adjusted terms. Now, don't get me wrong, there's still a huge market out there for Treasury debt. I mean, we've seen the Fed is happy to buy up Treasuries from commercial banks. They did a huge round of it after the 07-08 crash. Remember, quantitative easing, QE, that was basically buying Treasury debt and some other debt, which was worse, mortgage-backed debt, but buying Treasury debt from commercial banks and recapitalizing them, giving them money in exchange for it. And boy, they've done it in earnest over the last couple of years with COVID. That was a big part of monetary policy, was once again buying up Treasury debt. So the Fed provides a market for it. And all across the world, people own U.S. Treasuries, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, various governments, a lot of government central banks, other than our own, own huge amounts of Treasuries. We hear about the Chinese owning our debt. Well, that's somewhat true. The Chinese central bank owns a lot of U.S. Treasury debt. And so sometimes certain pension funds, private equity funds, et cetera, are actually required by their charters to own a certain percentage of U.S. Treasury debt. So there'll always be a market for this. But you're getting paid a negative interest rate on that. And that's about the safest form of investment we can think of as U.S. Treasuries. Other than just holding cash, if you just hold cash in a CD or a money market mutual fund, let's say a ready checking account, or in your local bank in some sort of checking or savings vehicle, that's not even getting that 3% on U.S. Treasury. That's probably getting 1%, maybe less than 1% now, but again, inflation's 8%. So you're losing money, folks, and this is all the result of this 40-year experiment in pushing rates down and down and down and down. And the idea is that the lower the interest rate is, the more people will spend money. The more they'll borrow, the more they'll spend. They'll buy that $700,000 house maybe instead of that $400,000 house they should buy based on, the realities of their income. Maybe they'll buy that Lexus instead of just buying that Ford Taurus. Maybe they'll go to Europe instead of just going to Disney in their car, right? I mean, we can imagine the ways in which low interest rates filter across society. And they tell people, don't save money, at least not the old-fashioned way, because you're losing. Savings is for chumps. And borrow money because that's what smart people do. And right now, there's a great case for going out there and borrowing as much as you can. I'm not advising that, but there's a case for saying borrow as much as you can if you can get it at 3.5%, let's say, a little under 4%, and get that fixed. And then inflation's 8%, go buy something that'll keep up with that. It's not so easy to figure out what that is. Is that gold? Is that some stock like Tesla? Some hot stock? Is that commodities, which are having a resurgence? Is that Bitcoin? Something speculative? I don't know. If I knew, I wouldn't be on the radio talking to you. I'd be out there doing it. But nonetheless, it's important to understand how important it is culturally what low interest rates do to a society, what they do to people's incentives, what they do to their natural desire to put money away and save for a rainy day, and maybe even beyond a rainy day, save for their kids and grandkids to have what they saved last longer than their lifetimes so that their kids and grandkids will be better off. I mean, this is the most natural inclination. This is such a human inclination, right? When you loan other people money, you expect to be paid for it because you're taking a risk they might not pay you back. We're not doing that, folks, and it has huge ramifications. This is Money Talk, 10:10 a.m. This is the Morgan Streetman Show. We'll be right back to finish the show. Stay with us. Welcome back, everybody. This is Money Talk 10:10 a.m. This is the Morgan Streetman Show. I'm not Morgan Streetman. I'm a friend and colleague of his, Jeff Deist. You can follow me at Mises on Twitter to find out more about what my employer, the Mises Institute, is doing. And what we're focusing on right now is, of course, what money's doing. We all want more of it. We all want more money, folks, but The money we've got and the money we're earning is buying us less and less, and it's just evaporating like quicksand through our fingers. We talked at the top of the show about some of these social divisions in this country, red versus blue, this polarization. COVID, of course, intensified that. We saw a lot of people moving to Florida. We saw Ron DeSantis championed by some folks and demonized by others. We've seen Florida really stand out as, I guess, taking one side in the culture war. That's not entirely true. I mean, there are obviously very deep blue areas in Florida, the South Florida, Miami. And if we go back to that gubernatorial election between Ron DeSantis and his opponent, well, where you call that was very, very close. So Florida is actually more divided politically, more closely divided than perhaps we think. But nonetheless, we consider the political polarization in this country when we still have a relatively stable economy, all things considered, even with the inflation going on. I mean, the unemployment rate feels pretty low simply because the economy was so hampered during COVID shutdowns that as it comes back, that feels like tremendous growth. Of course, the Biden administration has taken pains to point out that unemployment is in something in the 3%, which is historically quite low. But here's the thing. There's actually fewer jobs in America than there were before COVID. We haven't replaced all the jobs that existed prior to the COVID lockdowns. And it's very simple. A lot of people simply lost their appetite for working. People who were maybe older and closer to retirement but would have liked to work, maybe people who were stay-at-home spouses who would have liked to have that part-time job or that work-from-home job, but it evaporated during COVID and they just haven't replaced it. Younger people who have simply stopped looking, maybe they're spending their whole 20s. Let's not hope they're not piling up student loan debt and getting some master's or PhD until they're 30. There's all kinds of ways. Disabled folks who are receiving disability, who may have nonetheless like to work a little bit, but just stay home and live off of a smaller income. And people who have just been psychologically damaged by COVID and who have sort of fallen off the radar screen. I mean, unemployment counts people who are actively looking. And a lot of people just sort of gave up. And that's, I think, a pretty sad problem for America because we always need to think about economics in human terms. We can't just look at the numbers. We have to think about human beings and what they do and what are their incentives. That's so much more important than looking at things in this aggregate or macro level. But nonetheless, unemployment numbers are a bit misleading when we think of how many people have dropped out and when we understand there are still fewer people working than before COVID. So that's a bit of a headwind, folks. And when we think about inflation, which screws up all kinds of planning for all kinds of businesses. I mean, if you go to restaurants now, some of them, they used to say you had to pay market price for the fish of the day. They would say, you'd see that on the menu, market price. There wasn't a price listed by. Well, some restaurants are now doing that for certain cuts of beef and veal and lamb. That's interesting to me. They're just showing that uncertainty. They don't want to quote a price or keep changing their menu, reprinting their menu every 2 weeks or something like that. So they're just saying, you got to ask your server what that costs. But here's the thing, folks. Talking about low interest rates and talking about the cultural and social ramifications of what low interest rates do to a society. They make us borrow more money. They make us live more for today. They make us not save as much for a rainy day, or more importantly, build capital, both financial and more broadly cultural capital for future generations. I mean, why are we rich? Why is there cheap and abundant energy? Why is there a Starbucks on every corner? Why is the West so amazing from a material perspective? Why does dentistry keep getting better? All these little things which affect our lives in glorious ways. Well, it's because of capital accumulation. It's because previous generations, brought in more profit than they spent, and they saved and invested that, and that build up and build up and build up and build up. And that's cultural and capital accumulation. And now it seems like we're encouraged to do the opposite. We're encouraged to consume more than we make and to borrow and to spend. And if everyone does that on an individual level and that manifests itself throughout society, well, we can see what kind of problems we're going to have. Now, if we look at the U.S. federal government during the worst of the COVID period, during that year of 2020. Donald Trump was president, by the way. Let's not pin this one on Biden. Uncle Sam brought in about $3.5 trillion in taxes from all sources. It spent about $7 trillion. So literally $1 out of every $2 that Congress spent that year in fiscal 2020 was borrowed. Well, you do that enough times, and we've done it, not that amount, but we've had deficits for years and years and years. That all adds up to $30 trillion in the national debt. But if you look at that debt, the amount of it, it's spread across lots of different yields, lots of different bond amounts, and lots of different interest rates. So you have to weight it. But there's actually a website you can go to, and they average it out and weight it. And they say of that $30 trillion, the overall weighted interest rate, which Uncle Sam, which is us as taxpayers, about what we pay on that's only about 1.6%. Because interest rates, again, have been so low for so long that a lot of Treasury debt has been issued at very low bargain prices. It's not a bargain if you like to get paid interest. And as a result of that, the annual interest payment on the national debt, which Congress has to consider as part of its budget, it's only been about $500 or $600 billion in recent years, even with that enormous $30 trillion number. And again, that's a lot like a Tampa mortgage. If you can get really low interest rates of 3%, your mortgage payment won't be nearly as high as it would be if interest was 17% like back in the 80s. So Uncle Sam has enjoyed a wonderful privilege. Congress has been able to spend lots of money because interest isn't that high. It only costs them $500, $600 billion a year. But if interest was just where it normally has been across history, 5%, 6%, let's say, all of a sudden, folks, interest on the national debt would be the single biggest line item in the congressional budget, ahead of Social Security and Medicare and defense and all those other things we think the federal government's supposed to provide for us. Imagine that. Imagine if interest rates go up to 5 or 6%, and that's what people demand for Treasury debt. Could happen, folks. All of a sudden, Uncle Sam would be faced with some very tough choices and some cuts in those programs that people rely on, including Social Security and Medicare. This is the Morgan Streetman Show from 10 to 11. I've been your guest host, Jeff Deist. Really enjoyed being with all of you. Hope that wasn't too much cold water to the face on a Monday morning. This is Money Talk 1010 a.m.
Thank you for listening to the Morgan Streetman Show. We hope you enjoyed what you heard, and if you did, please click like and subscribe to help us out. And remember that we recommend that you exercise your brain at least once a week.